Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be tackling a pretty big question.
Yeah.
Why do some nations thrive while others just really struggle? We're talking global economic disparity.
Right.
And to help us unpack some of the theories, we're diving into a lecture from James Robinson.
Okay.
He's the co-author of the book Why Nations Fail.
Oh, yeah, I know that book.
And he gave this lecture at the London School of Economics back in 2011.
Interesting.
But what's so fascinating is that his ideas,
Yeah.
they seem even more relevant now than they were back then.
I think that's so true. And what I find really compelling about Robinson's work
Yeah.
is that he doesn't just settle for those simple explanations for this disparity.
Right.
We always hear about, oh, it's just because of resources or geography
Right.
or even culture.
Oh, yeah, you hear that one a lot.
Right. But he digs deeper.
He does.
He really digs into the impact of what he calls institutions
Okay.
on a nation's trajectory.
Yeah, that's a big one, right?
It is.
That institute,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of at the core of his whole argument.
Yeah.
So we've got this image from the source material.
Go ahead.
It's a chart, and it compares average GDP per capita in different regions of the world.
Right.
And we're looking at like a time span of 1000 AD all the way to 2000.
1,000 years.
1,000 years. And what you see is
Yeah.
this huge divergence, right?
Wow.
Western offshoots like the US, Canada,
Yeah.
Australia,
Mm-hmm.
their GDP just shoots up. It's like a hockey stick.
Oh, wow.
But then you look at many parts of Africa,
Yeah.
and they barely even register on the chart.
Oh, wow. That's,
It's a really stark visual
it is, yeah.
of this gap,
Yeah, it really is.
this economic gap.
And it makes you ask, like, why?
Right. Why? What's driving this?
Yeah, what are the factors?
Exactly.
And Robinson argues that one of the key factors
Okay.
is the kind of institutions a nation develops,
Oh.
specifically whether they're extractive or inclusive.
Okay, so I think we've got to unpack those terms because they're kind of
Yeah.
central
Yeah, oh, yeah.
to his argument. Right. So extractive institutions.
Yeah.
What are we talking about here?
So imagine, like, a system
Okay.
designed to extract wealth from the majority
Okay.
and funnel it
Yeah.
into the hands of a small, powerful elite.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That's extractive.
So like way back in the day when you had the Spanish conquistadors
Yeah.
exploiting the indigenous populations
Right.
in Latin America,
Exactly.
would that be like a classic example?
A classic example.
Okay.
They came in, they took control
Yep.
of the land, the resources,
Mm-hmm.
and forced the indigenous people to work for their benefit.
Right.
It was all about concentrating power and wealth at the top.
Gotcha.
And here's the thing about these systems.
Yeah.
They often lack things like
Okay.
the rule of law,
Mm-hmm.
secure property rights.
Okay.
So it becomes really difficult
Yeah.
for people to, like, invest, innovate,
Right.
build wealth for themselves.
Gotcha. So extractive is kind of like a select few benefiting
Right.
at the expense of everyone else.
Yep.
Okay. Now, what about inclusive institutions?
Yeah, so inclusive institutions are more about
Okay.
leveling the playing field.
Oh, okay.
You know, creating an environment where more
Yeah.
people have the opportunity to participate and prosper.
Got it.
So you're thinking things like
Okay.
secure property rights,
Uh-huh.
a fair and impartial legal system,
Yeah.
open markets where anyone can compete.
Mm-hmm.
It's about empowering a broader segment of society,
I see.
not just a select few.
Okay. So to put it simply,
Yeah.
inclusive institutions spread the wealth.
Yeah.
And extractive hoard it.
You got it.
Okay. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And to really understand the long-term consequences.
Of these different systems.
Right.
Robinson starts by comparing early colonization in Latin America
Okay.
and North America.
All right. So tell me about this tale of two beginnings.
All right, so Robinson talks about this guy,
Okay.
Juan Diaz de Solís,
Okay.
and he sails into the Rio de la Plata in South America
Okay.
in 1516.
All right.
And he and other conquistadors like Pedro de Mendoza,
Mm-hmm.
who founded Buenos Aires, by the way,
Okay.
they were all about just grabbing land,
Mm.
grabbing resources, extracting as much wealth as they possibly could.
Oh, okay.
They tried to enslave the indigenous Charrúas and Kurandi people.
Mm.
But those groups, they were nomadic hunter-gatherers.
Okay.
So it made it near impossible
Right.
to force them into plantation labor,
Yeah.
which was the kind of system the Spanish had in mind.
Oh, so even their attempts at extraction didn't work?
Okay, it didn't.
Initially because they couldn't control the labor force?
Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, so these early Spanish settlements,
Yeah.
they actually failed.
Wow.
The Spanish ended up starving
Oh, wow.
and abandoning the area.
Wow. Okay, so what happened next?
So a few years later, in 1537,
Okay.
Juan de Olas, he heads inland.
Okay.
And he encounters the Guarani people in Paraguay.
Okay.
Now, the Guarani,
Yeah.
they were a more settled agricultural society,
Oh, okay.
which meant that the Spanish,
Yeah.
they could conquer them,
Right.
enslave them,
Mm-hmm.
and force them into working the land,
Wow.
producing food for the Spanish colonizers.
So they finally found a population they could exploit
Exactly.
to establish their system.
Right, and this pattern, sadly, it's not unique to this one instance. We see it happening all across Latin America.
Yeah.
With the conquest of the Aztecs, the Incas.
It's like they were trying to transplant the European feudal system, which was in many ways extractive itself, onto this new continent.
Exactly. And you see this playing out
Yeah.
in a very different way
Okay.
in North America around the same time.
Okay.
So you've got the Virginia Company.
Yeah.
They're trying to establish themselves in Jamestown
Uh-huh.
using a similar extractive model.
Right. Control the land.
Yeah.
Control the labor, extract the wealth.
Exactly. They even implemented these harsh laws,
Oh, wow.
like the death penalty
Oh, my gosh.
for stealing an ear of corn
Wow. That's intense.
to enforce their control.
Okay.
But here's where things get interesting.
Okay.
They tried to impose this on the English settlers,
Mm-hmm.
but the colonists, they weren't having it.
Oh, they pushed back.
They pushed back. They had a very different mindset,
Okay.
and they were prepared to fight for their rights.
So the Virginia Company's plan backfired.
Big time. They had to shift gears.
Oh, wow.
They introduced this head rights system,
Okay.
which gave each settler 50 acres of land.
Oh, wow.
And later, they granted them political rights,
Okay.
including the formation of their own General Assembly
Wow.
in 1619.
Interesting.
And this wasn't just a Virginia thing either.
Oh,
It
okay.
happened in other colonies too, like
Oh.
Pennsylvania and the Carolinas.
Interesting. So it's kind of setting the stage for a society built on very different foundations
Yes.
from those we see in Latin America.
Right.
So instead of doubling down on extraction,
Mm-hmm.
they were forced to create a system that's more inclusive.
Exactly. And this leads to
Yeah.
the emergence of institutions we now associate with inclusive systems,
Right.
like protection of property rights,
Mm-hmm.
representative government,
Yeah.
and emphasis on individual liberty.
And these differences, as Robinson argues, had huge long-term consequences.
Absolutely. And there's some really fascinating research
Yeah.
that shows this lasting impact.
Okay.
Like economist Melissa Dell's work on the lingering effects
Mm-hmm.
of the Mita system in Peru.
Okay.
You know, it was a system of forced labor
Yeah.
from the colonial era.
Right.
And she found that even centuries later,
Wow.
areas that were subjected to the Mita,
Mm-hmm.
they still lag behind
Wow.
in economic development.
It's incredible that something that happened so long ago still has a measurable impact
I know, it's amazing, right?
today.
It really is.
It really underscores
It did.
how much those initial institutional choices matter.
It really does. It sets the stage for understanding
Right.
how these different paths, extractive versus inclusive,
Mm-hmm.
play out over time.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to keep digging into.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So stay with us.
Yes, stay tuned.
We're going to unpack all of that.
Keep going.
More after the break.
All right.
So we've been talking about these two very different paths, right?
Yeah.
Extractive versus inclusive that kind of emerged during the colonial era.
Right.
But how did they actually play out over time?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Like, did inclusive institutions always lead to success?
Right.
And were extractive institutions just like
Doomed to fail.
doomed to fail?
Yeah, and it's where things get
Okay.
really interesting.
Right.
So while sustained economic growth
Mm-hmm.
is definitely more likely under inclusive institutions,
Well, okay.
it's not impossible for countries with extractive systems
Right.
to see periods of growth.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So extractive systems aren't always
They're not always a recipe for
a
disaster,
recipe for disaster.
but there's a catch.
Okay, there's a catch.
Robinson argues that growth under extractive systems
Yeah.
tends to be unsustainable.
Oh.
So think about it. It's often driven by top-down control, forced labor,
Right.
or exploitation of natural resources,
Yeah.
rather than genuine innovation and entrepreneurship.
So it's more about like squeezing
Exactly.
as much as possible
Yeah.
out of the existing resources
Mhm.
rather than creating new wealth.
Exactly. And because those benefits are concentrated at the top,
Right.
there's little incentive to invest in
Okay.
things like education
Yeah.
or infrastructure that would benefit the broader population.
Right. It's like they're trying to build a skyscraper
It is, yeah.
on a foundation of sand.
Exactly. It might look impressive for a while,
Yeah.
but it's inherently unstable.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Are there any historical examples
Yeah, there are.
of this kind of unsustainable growth
Yeah.
under extractive systems?
Robinson uses the example of the Soviet Union
Okay.
in the mid-20th century.
Oh, yeah.
They saw some pretty impressive economic growth for a time,
Yeah.
even with this highly extractive political system.
Wow. So even with that system.
Yeah, and in fact,
Yeah.
the economist Paul Samuelson,
Okay.
he even predicted
Yeah.
in his 1961 textbook
Okay.
that the Soviet economy might surpass that of the United States.
Wow. That's a bold prediction.
It is.
Did it come true?
Not exactly.
Okay.
It turns out that growth under extractive systems
Yeah.
is kind of like a sugar rush.
Oh,
You
okay.
get that quick burst of energy,
Mm-hmm.
but then you crash.
You crash, yeah.
The Soviet Union's economy eventually stagnated,
Right.
and then it imploded.
Yeah.
Largely because its extractive institutions just couldn't keep up
Wow.
with the demands of a modern economy
Right.
that thrives on innovation and adaptability.
Right. So ultimately that system just couldn't sustain itself.
Exactly.
It's fascinating.
It is.
It makes me wonder, how do institutions change?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
It is, right?
And it's rarely a smooth or easy process.
Of course.
Robinson talks about two ways
All right.
that institutional change can happen.
Right.
Through what he calls institutional drift
Okay.
and critical junctures.
Those sound like some pretty academic terms.
They do, yeah.
Can you break those down for us?
Of course.
The non-academics.
So institutional drift is basically the idea that institutions change gradually
Okay.
over time,
Mm-hmm.
often in small incremental ways.
So not like a sudden revolution,
Yeah.
but like a gradual shift.
Yeah, like a slow evolution.
Yeah, okay.
But then you have these critical junctures,
Right.
which are these major events or shocks
Okay.
that disrupt the status quo
Yeah.
and create opportunities for more dramatic shifts.
So like those moments in history where everything's up for grabs.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what's fascinating is that
Yeah.
the same event can have very different outcomes
Okay.
depending on the existing institutional context.
Interesting.
So Robinson uses the example of the Black Death,
Okay. The Black Death.
that devastating plague.
Right. That swept through Europe.
Yeah, in the 14th century.
Okay.
So in Western Europe,
Yeah.
where feudalism was already starting to weaken,
Right.
the Black Death actually led to a decline
Okay.
in the power of landlords
Interesting.
and a shift towards more free labor.
Okay.
But in Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
where feudalism was more deeply entrenched,
Mm-hmm.
the opposite happened.
Oh, wow.
The plague actually strengthened the grip
Okay.
of landlords on their serfs,
Wow.
leading to something called the Second Serfdom.
Wow. That's amazing how same event,
It is.
this massive demographic shock had such different consequences
I know.
depending on the institutions that were already in place.
It really shows you
Yeah.
how history is not predetermined.
Right.
The choices societies make in response to these events
Yeah.
can have long-lasting effects.
Yeah.
Speaking of critical junctures,
Okay.
what about the Glorious Revolution in England?
Right. In 1688,
Yeah,
that's often seen as like a turning point
it is.
in the development of more inclusive institutions.
Absolutely.
So what happened there?
Well, the Glorious Revolution really
Yeah.
shifted the balance of power in England.
Okay.
It limited the power of the monarchy
Okay.
and strengthened the role of Parliament.
So more towards a constitutional.
Yeah, and a representative government.
And this created the conditions for the Industrial Revolution to
Exactly.
take off in England.
The Glorious Revolution fostered this environment
Right.
of greater economic freedom.
Okay.
Property rights were more secure,
Yeah.
and individuals had more incentives to invest, innovate, and take risks.
So while other countries were clinging
Yeah.
to these extractive systems,
Right.
England was embracing a more inclusive model.
Exactly. And it unleashed this wave
Yeah.
of technological and economic progress.
It highlights how institutions
Mm-hmm.
can make or break a nation's ability to adapt
Yeah.
and thrive
They can.
But if the Industrial Revolution was such a game changer,
Yeah.
why didn't it spread more quickly?
That's a great question.
Around the globe.
And it goes back to the power of institutions.
Okay.
So some countries, particularly in Eastern Europe
Okay.
and the Ottoman Empire,
Right.
had these long-standing extractive institutions
Yeah.
that held them back.
Right.
They were essentially trapped
Wow.
in systems that stifled innovation and progress.
It's like they were trying to run a marathon
Yeah, it is.
with their legs tied together.
Exactly.
Is there a particular example of this?
Robinson uses this fascinating example of the printing press.
Okay, yeah.
So the printing press revolutionized the spread of knowledge and ideas in Europe.
Right.
But in the Ottoman Empire,
Yeah.
the rulers, they feared the spread of ideas
Right.
that might challenge their power.
Right.
So they banned printing in Arabic for centuries.
Wow. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot.
Right. They were so focused on maintaining control
Yeah.
that they missed out on this transformative technology.
Wow. Okay, so we've established that institutions matter
They do.
a lot,
A lot.
but they're not set in stone.
Right.
They can change,
They can.
but it's complex
It is.
and often messy.
It is, yeah.
And even when change does happen, there are powerful forces that can pull things back
Right.
towards the status quo.
Robinson calls this institutional persistence.
So even if you break free from an extractive system, there's always that risk of backsliding.
There is.
Okay.
And this persistence can create
Yeah.
both virtuous and vicious cycles.
Okay, so give me an example of the virtuous cycle.
So in Britain,
Okay.
the inclusive institutions that emerged
Yeah.
after the Glorious Revolution, they actually became more inclusive over time
Okay.
as they responded to challenges and pressures.
So it's like a positive feedback loop.
Exactly.
Okay.
Each step towards greater inclusion
Yeah.
reinforced the system
Data stronger.
and made it more resilient.
Okay, what about an example on the flip side?
Yeah, unfortunately,
Yeah.
there are examples of institutional persistence
Yeah.
on the extractive side.
Give me one.
A prime example
Okay.
is the U.S. South after the Civil War.
Okay, interesting.
Even though slavery was abolished
Right.
and Black Americans were granted citizenship and voting rights,
Right.
the underlying power structures remain largely intact.
So the laws changed,
Yeah.
but the reality on the ground
Didn't really shift.
didn't shift that much.
Yeah.
Okay.
The former slave-owning elite,
Yeah.
despite losing the war, managed to cling to power
Wow.
and maintain a system that was still deeply extractive.
Wow, so they were still able to.
They used tools like
Yeah.
black codes,
Right.
vagrancy laws,
Yeah.
even violence,
Right.
through groups like the Ku Klux Klan,
Yeah.
to control labor and extract wealth from Black Americans.
It's a stark reminder that institutional change
It is.
isn't just about rewriting laws.
No, it's not.
It's about fundamentally changing
It is.
the balance of power
Yeah.
in a society.
And ensuring those changes are embedded
Yes.
in the fabric of society.
It makes you wonder
It does.
if these dynamics
Yeah.
of extractive institutions
Yeah.
are still playing out
They are.
in the 21st century.
Absolutely. And that's what we'll explore next
Okay.
as we look at some modern examples
All right.
of nations struggling with this legacy
Okay.
of extractive systems.
Let's do it. It's really fascinating stuff.
It is.
You know, tracing the impact of these different models
Yeah.
throughout history.
Extractive versus inclusive?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, like, are these dynamics still playing out today?
They are, absolutely.
In the world today?
Sadly, yeah.
Right.
The legacy of these extractive institutions is still alive and well.
Okay, so let's bring it into the 21st century then.
Okay.
Where are we headed?
Robinson highlights a really striking example in his lecture.
Okay.
Uzbekistan.
Uzbekistan.
Yeah, a country in Central Asia
Okay.
that gained independence from the Soviet Union back in 1991.
Okay, so what's the situation like there?
Yeah.
Why is it an example of extractive institutions at work?
Robinson paints a pretty grim picture.
Okay.
He describes how in 2006,
Yeah?
something like 2.7 million children
Wow.
were suddenly pulled out of schools across Uzbekistan.
Wow. But,
And it wasn't for a holiday
right.
or some national event.
Okay.
They were forced to go work
Wow.
in the cotton fields.
Forced child labor.
Yeah,
That's awful.
it is. And it's a direct result.
Yeah. Of the country's extractive institutions,
Okay.
the government, under President Islam Karimov,
Right?
forces cotton farmers to sell their crops
Yeah.
at these extremely low prices,
Okay.
leaving them with very little profit.
Right.
and no real incentive to invest or improve their methods.
So they resort to the cheapest form of labor they can find.
Sadly, yes.
Children.
It's a tragic example of how these extractive systems
Yeah.
dehumanize people,
Yeah.
exploit them for the benefit of a small elite.
And it's not just Uzbekistan, right?
It's not, no.
We see this in other countries.
We do.
With weak institutions,
Yeah.
a history of corruption.
Absolutely.
It's heartbreaking to think about those kids.
It is.
Being robbed of their education,
Yeah.
your childhood.
Uh-huh.
It really brings home the human cost
It does.
of these extractive systems.
Mm.
But is there any hope for countries like Uzbekistan?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And it's one that Robinson tackles in his work. He argues that change is possible,
Okay.
but it's often a long and difficult process.
Right.
He points to examples like the end
Okay.
of that Southern equilibrium in the U.S.
Right, that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, the civil rights movement
Right.
was a powerful force for change,
Oh, what?
challenging those deeply entrenched extractive institutions.
Right, of the Jim Crow South.
Exactly.
It was a long, hard-fought battle.
It was.
But ultimately,
Yeah.
it led to significant progress
It did.
toward racial equality
Yeah.
and a more inclusive society.
And it shows that even in societies
Yeah.
with these deep divisions
Yeah.
and a long history of inequality,
Yeah.
change is possible.
It is possible.
But it requires a sustained effort,
Right.
a willingness to challenge the status quo,
Mm-hmm.
a commitment to building new,
Right.
more inclusive institutions.
So if the U.S. South is an example of moving away
Well,
from extractive institutions,
yeah.
what about a nation that's managed to build something more inclusive from the ground up? Is
Yeah.
there like a country,
Robinson points to the case of Botswana.
Botswana?
Yeah, it's a landlocked country in southern Africa
Okay.
that was once one of the poorest in the world.
Really? Okay.
But since its independence in 1966,
Yeah.
it's undergone a remarkable transformation.
So what was their secret? What did they do?
Well, a lot of it has to do
Yeah.
with the choices they made early on.
Okay.
Botswana was lucky to have a group of leaders
Yeah.
who were genuinely committed
Okay.
to building inclusive institutions.
Right.
They invested heavily
Yeah.
in education, healthcare, infrastructure,
Right.
and they prioritized good governance,
Okay.
transparency, the rule of law.
So they created a system that was designed to benefit everyone.
Exactly, and the results speak for themselves.
What happened?
Botswana has experienced sustained economic growth,
Okay.
a rising standard of living,
Wow.
and a relatively peaceful and stable society.
Wow. That's amazing.
It's the test of the power of inclusive institutions
Yeah.
to transform a nation's destiny.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
But I imagine building these inclusive institutions,
Yeah.
especially in countries with a history of extractive systems,
Mm-hmm.
it can't be easy.
It's not. It's rarely simple or straightforward.
Right.
You know, it often involves navigating
Yeah.
complex political dynamics,
Right.
overcoming resistance from those who benefit
Of course.
from the existing system,
Of course.
and making tough choices
Right.
that might require sacrifices
Yeah. Yeah.
in the short term for those long-term gains.
So there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Nope.
It sounds like.
Each country's journey is going to be unique,
Right. We're talking about like
shaped by its own history,
Yeah.
culture,
yeah,
the specific challenges it faces.
a fundamental shift in mindset almost.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is like a change in how power is distributed,
Yeah.
exercised.
Not just tweaking a few policies.
It's about a whole new set
Yeah.
of rules of the game.
Yeah. Exactly. And that can be really challenging,
It can be, yeah,
especially with powerful elites
especially when they're invested.
invested in maintaining that status quo.
Right,
So as we kind of wrap things up here,
yeah.
what are the key takeaways?
I think one of the big ones is that
Yeah.
we need to move beyond those simple explanations
Right.
for global inequality.
We can't just say it's geography or
Hmm.
culture or lack of effort.
Exactly. We have to acknowledge the role that institutions play
Right.
in shaping these outcomes.
We've seen how inclusive institutions can create that virtuous cycle.
Right, leading to greater prosperity, stability.
But we've also seen how those extractive institutions
Yeah.
can trap nations in these cycles of poverty and conflict.
Yeah.
And as we've discussed, these institutions, they're not just some natural phenomenon.
No.
They're products of human choices.
They are.
The decisions that societies make
Mm.
about how they organize themselves, how they distribute power, how they allocate resources.
It has a huge impact.
It can have profound and lasting consequences.
It can.
So it's not just about understanding why some nations fail.
Right.
It's about understanding how we can create the conditions for all nations to succeed.
Exactly. Recognizing that we have the power
Yeah.
to shape the institutions that determine the future of our societies and our planet.
Well, that's a powerful note to end on.
It is.
Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with me.
My pleasure. I always enjoy exploring these big ideas,
I do too.
and I hope our listeners found it valuable.
To our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you some new insights, new perspectives on the forces that shape our world.
Absolutely.
Remember, the quest for a more just and prosperous world
Yeah,
requires the active participation
it does.
of informed and engaged citizens.
It does.
So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
That's it for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time
See you then.
for another fascinating exploration of the ideas that shape our world.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks for listening.